Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today, I'm here with Professor Dale C. Allison Jr. He's the Richard Dearborn Professor of New Testament Studies at Princeton Theological Seminary, probably also the world's leading scholar on the Gospel of Matthew. And Professor Allison, it's such an honor to be speaking with you, especially since we're both from Kansas. And yeah, I mean, I don't know what else to say. You are probably one of the best scholars out there.
Well, thank you so much. I'm happy to be here, and I'm really happy to talk about the subject today because I don't get to talk about it enough, and I think it's a really fascinating and important subject for people to think about. So I'm happy to promote the cause on this one.
Yeah, well, I was first exposed to actually this appearance of, um, well, I'll say alleged appearance of Mary in Zeitoun, Egypt,
Uh-huh.
through your book on the resurrection of Jesus, looking at
Uh-huh.
apologetics, polemics, and history. And I thought it would be great to engage this subject, especially since actually in the online world, this topic has come up again.
Oh, it has. Okay.
Yeah, so yeah, Professor, do you want to say anything before we just get started?
Well, I was just going to say, I don't know much about the online world. I do grant interviews. I'm happy to talk to people, but I'm a book person. So when I'm done with you, I'm going back to my book. So I have no idea what's going on the internet or social media or whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean, somebody brought it up in relation to Catholic and Protestant debates,
Uh-huh.
and so it kind of exploded again. And I thought, who else to talk to than probably one of the world's leading experts on the subject? So, Professor Allison, let me begin by just asking you, you know, what do we know about what happened in Zaytun, Egypt from 1968 to 1971?
So you have a series of alleged apparitions of Mary. And it starts in, I think it was April of 1968. And there's a church, St. Mary's, which is in Zeitoun. And Zeitoun is like a suburb of Cairo. And there were some people working in a repair shop or auto shop, a body shop. And a couple of men, they were both Muslim, came out to have some tea on the sidewalk and take a little break. And they looked up at the church, at the top of the church across the street. And St. Mary's has several domes, but it has one very large dome and with a cross at the top. And they thought they saw the figure of a woman who was about to commit suicide. They thought she was going to jump off. And one of them ran to get the police, and one of them ran to get a priest, and then somebody else showed up soon enough, several people. And it wasn't long before somebody decided that's not a young woman threatening suicide. For one thing, she's seemingly standing on the dome, and it's a dome. I mean, there's no real place to stand, right?
Mm.
And somebody yells out, "Oh, that's the Virgin." Now, this makes sense in the context because uh, Mary is a very important figure for Coptic Orthodox Egyptian Christians, and the church itself is St. Mary's. All right. So this identification was made very, very quickly. And then what happens is over the following weeks, there are multiple appearances. And these actually go on into 1971. They sort of slow down at the beginning of 71. There are a few in 1971, one large one, but then they sort of just go away. Now, um, I thought, if you'll indulge me, that what I might do here in order to introduce the subject would be to read a couple of firsthand testimonies.
Oh yeah.
Before I do that, though, let me say that this is a really well-attested event. Uh, it became a sort of thing to do to go to Zeitoun and see the lights. And on many evenings early on, people said there were 10 or 20,000. There were later evenings when people said 50,000. There were some estimates later on that it got up to 100 or 200,000. Now, people can be very bad at estimating crowd size, But these were very large crowds, and some people have estimated by the time that it was all done and counting repeat customers, there might have been 1 million people who went to see this event. In any case, we have tons of interviews. And by the way, there was a Coptic newsletter that followed this from the beginning. And I can't remember whether it was published every week or every month, but they would include in every issue the latest testimonies from witnesses to this. So we have firsthand interviews with people while the event is going on. All right. So here are a couple of testimonies. Here's the first one. About 9 or 9:30 at night, a light appeared in the center of the opening beneath the small dome. The light took the shape of a sphere moving up and down. Then very slowly it moved out through the supporting archway and took the form of St. Mary. It lasted 2 or 3 minutes, and as usual, the people shouted to her. She usually acknowledges their greetings with both hands or with one, if she should be holding the olive branch or the Christ child. She looks somewhat happy and smiling, but somewhat sad, always kindly. She then returned to the dome, and the figure became again a round ball of light and gradually faded into the darkness. I don't know if you know The Wizard of Oz, the old movie from
Yeah.
1939. This is exactly how the good witch appears. She's a ball of light. She comes and then becomes a figure, and then she turns into a ball of light and goes away. I don't know what to make of that. But in any case, after about 10 minutes, the cycle started again. I saw it several times between 10 and 3:30 a.m. at about 10-minute intervals. As she would disappear under one dome and darkness had come, she would appear under another of the domes or over the entrance into the courtyard. It was St. Mary in complete form that I saw, head to foot, very bright, not bluish, yet not hurting the eyes. It actually seemed to soothe the eyes. No features were visible. No features could be distinguished, but the outline was that of a very beautiful figure. This scene I saw countless times. There's also the phenomenon of the incense. The smoke of incense, very bright, comes out of the large dome in unbelievable quantities. The cloud goes up to 10 or 20 meters or more. It is dark red. There is no other cloud in the sky but the one over the dome. It then takes the form of St. Mary as stars appear and disappear over the church. Okay, well, if you had one of those, you would just say somebody's hallucinating. What do you do when you have thousands? Here's another one. At about 9:50, we saw lightning over the church, much stronger than one could make with a flashlight. I had a feeling something was about to happen. A thin line or edge of light appeared like the light you see when you open the door to a lighted room. Within seconds, it formed itself into the shape of the Virgin. I could not speak. All who were with me said, "It is impossible." The Muslims all started to cry. The sight lasted for 5 minutes when this figure rose and vanished. When she disappeared from our side of the church, the people from the other shouted that they were seeing her. Then she returned to our side for 5 minutes. When I returned to the car for something, I found it impossible to get back to the church because of the crowd. I could hear the people shouting. Above the center dome, I saw Mary in full body standing before the cross. I cannot describe what I felt. There were some pigeons, 6 or 7 of them, over the church. Now, by pigeons, he's referring to what other witnesses called doves, and they're figures of light. I also thought I would show you, if we can do this,
Hmm.
if I can hold this up. I have a couple of pictures. These are probably the two most famous pictures. And these actually occur in a book. I have this book, which was published in 1969. So this is published when they were still going on. And the two photos, for what it's worth, have been investigated
Yeah.
by somebody who's supposed to be a photographic expert. And these two, he didn't see any sign of tampering with them. There was another photo that he thought had been tampered with. But these, in any case, have appeared in the literature ever since. So if they were tampered with, they were tampered with right at the beginning.
Wow.
So here's the first one. Can you
Yeah, I can
see
see it.
that? You can see,
Hmm.
okay, and you see the pigeon or dove above the head of whatever this is, right?
Yeah, I do.
And then I have another one, which is a little more indistinct, but you can see the dome quite clearly. And then there's a luminous figure with that halo, right? Yeah, can you see that?
Yeah, I
See
can
the
see the second
dome?
image.
Yeah, and the halo around the whatever this is, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so those pictures were taken early on. So this was very important for the Egyptians, both Christian and Muslim, because they were in a bad way after losing the war with Israel. And this gave them the sense that God was still with them. And it also was very good for ecumenical relations between the Coptic Christians and the Egyptian Muslims. Now, if you talk to Coptic Christians anywhere in the world today, they all know about this event. And they almost all think that this was Mary. And many of them regard this as a major event in church history. And we have a diaspora of Coptic Christians here in New Jersey. They all
Mm.
know about this. Some of them were there as children and they can still tell the stories and they can recall what happened. This is the case in Australia and all over the world. Wherever you find a community of Coptic Christians, you're going to find people who know about Zeitoun. And still at this point, probably somebody who was there or whose brother was there or father was there and told them the story. But outside of Egypt, this just never got much attention.
Mm.
It didn't get much attention from the secular Western press at the time. I think there was one article in the New York Times. One of the London papers ran an article on it, but it just didn't get any traction in the popular press. And then it's pretty much confined to what you might call Coptic apologetical literature or Catholic devotional or apologetical literature, and then the literature of skeptics, because once in a while a skeptic will run across this and say, oh my goodness, how do we debunk this? But it hasn't had much of a life uh, outside of that.
Mm.
Uh, Maybe it's because in the West, Coptic Christianity isn't a big deal. Maybe that's all it is. You hear a lot more about Roman Catholic apparitions in Europe, for example, than you do about Zeitoun. But it's a really important event in Egyptian Christianity.
Mm. And as we look at these eyewitnesses, did, let's say, the lights or Mary or whatever we're gonna call, these apparitions, were
Uh-huh.
they did she only appear to people who were like predisposed to thinking that it was Mary? Did she only appear to, Christians and Orthodox?
Hmm.
Were people who were even skeptics able to see something?
Okay, so the second testimony that I read to you was actually by a Protestant who was with a group of Protestants trying to figure out what this was. And he was convinced, I don't know what it did to his theology, but he was convinced that this was Mary because he had seen her himself. So we do have those stories. We have Protestants who don't have a Mariology who see this and say, my goodness, it looks like it was Mary. Also, many, I don't know what percentage of the witnesses were Muslim, not Christian. So I don't know if you know, but Mary
Mhm.
does show up in the Quran, and there's a little passage that sounds like it's dependent on Luke 1 and Mary meeting the angel, although I think it's several angels in the Quran. But anyway, Mary is a friend of God in Islam or a saint. And they were okay with this being Mary.
Yeah.
So lots, lots of Muslim people. I did run across uh, an account from a skeptical secular journalist who was there during the first year, and her testimony is very strange because
Mm.
she says, "When I looked, I saw, oh, I think I can see a light. Oh, I think I can see a column of light. And then can I make out, something that looks like a nun? That was her term. And she thought, yeah, I can. But I'm probably just hallucinating. And then it would go away. It's a really strange account. So she sees something and she thinks maybe it is the figure of a woman, but then she doubts herself and it goes away. Um, Sometimes, if you look at these testimonies, the people will speak more of a sort of glowing figure without details, as in the two photographs I showed you. But other times, people are
Right.
talking about teeth
Hmm.
and facial expressions and all the rest of it. So uh, that's part of the puzzle of this. It appears to be intersubjective. That is, people, more than one person is seeing this, and it sounds like many of them are seeing the same thing. But it also sounds like maybe not all of them are seeing the same thing, which is just really weird. It messes with your normal categories. What is this?
Were there
Yeah.
attempts to debunk Zeitoun, and did any of them work?
So there were attempts to investigate. So one possibility, of course, is that it's fraud. Somebody is doing this. So maybe it's religious individuals with a motive. Or some people thought because it turned out to be a great tourist attraction, you know, people came to Cairo, to Zeitoun to see this, that maybe somebody in the government had planned this thing. But there was an investigative committee commissioned by the Coptic Church, and they went and explored the church and they looked everywhere. I've actually spoken to a relative of the man who led the investigation, and they weren't incompetent and they were trying to look for fraud. There was nothing in the dome. Uh, there was just no evidence of anything. Nobody was up there doing funny things. The city also at one point cut off the electricity to the grid this church was on, and the only light left was the light at the top of the dome. So, I don't think anybody had the technology in 1968 to do this. I don't know that anybody has the technology today. You could think of a Van de Graaff generator or modern holography or hologram, something like that.
Hmm.
But there was never any evidence of that. I suppose the most infamous theory uh, was by a man named Persinger, Michael Persinger. I don't know if you are old enough to remember the hullabaloo about the God helmet, but this was the neuroscientist who said he'd invented a helmet. You could put it on your head, and he'd run electrical things through your skull, and then you'd see God and have
Oh,
mystical
yeah.
experiences and
Hmm.
so on. Okay, that to my knowledge, that hasn't panned out very well. But his theory was that this was due to tectonic strain. So earthquake lights are a well-known phenomenon. Sometimes when the earth moves, it generates electricity, which can take the form of light. And so he thought, well, maybe this is what's happening here. And then he thought, maybe the electrical discharge is also messing with the temporal lobes of some people who are real sensitive, so they're hallucinating. This seems to me to be a just so story, an after the fact, really weak thing. And there are no parallels to it as far as I know. This is a figure which shows up at the same pretty much confined spot for 3 years or more. Uh, now, some people can see details of a female in that this just doesn't make any sense. So I think that's just grasping for anything. I suppose most people who are skeptics, if you'd ask them, would just throw out mass hallucination. But that's a weird one to me because we do have some photographs and they seem to show something. And if you read the eyewitnesses, there's no doubt that there's a light up there and that they are seeing some of the same things. This is not just auto suggestion. Everybody thinks so. It's Mary and so on. Um, so I don't think any of the skeptical scenarios make much sense. And
Hmm.
that's one of the important things about Zeitoun for me. The lesson is at this point in time, I haven't come across a sensible, materialistic, naturalistic, reductionistic explanation of whatever
Hmm.
this was that was going on.
I suppose a skeptic could say that because you mentioned how the Coptic Church did its own investigation on the
Uh-huh.
dome, and they could say, "Oh well, come on," but it's the Coptic Church doing the investigation. They'd want to say that no fraud was found. They should
Hmm.
have let in, I don't know, a secular team of scientists to investigate. What
Yeah.
would you say in response to that?
Well, I would say that you can doubt everything. I mean, skeptic. You just think of Descartes. Descartes can doubt everything until he gets to his own existence, right? So, yeah, you can always doubt. You can play these games, but if you're an historian, I think what you have to do is look at probabilities. That's what you're given. You're not looking at certainties, and it seems to me overwhelmingly probable, given everything we know,
Mm,
uh, that there was a real phenomenon and that it was interpreted by people as being um, the Virgin Mary. Now, I myself, I think there are two options here at the present time. So I don't think this is just waved away with mass hallucination. Tectonic
mm,
strain doesn't make any sense. The fraud theory is just empty. I think it's either Mary or a something we know not what. Okay? A something we know not what.
hmm
And given who I am, I'm okay with a something we know not what. Uh, I think if you are a Coptic Christian or Roman Catholic Christian of particular persuasion, this will almost seem like a slam dunk. Like, what else could it be, right? It's just got to be Mary. But if you don't, if you're not living with a Mariology or within that worldview, uh, and you're not satisfied with any of the debunking claims, you'll just say, well, this is really interesting and I don't know how to explain it. I personally think that people need to do that a lot more often than they do. We're often really, when we're defending worldviews, we're really hasty to make sure that something fits or doesn't, whatever it is fits with what we're doing. I'm just not a dogmatist that way.
Sure. And what do you think about the like the demon hypothesis? Okay, yeah, it was supernatural, but it was this evil, spirit that's trying to deceive, people into thinking in accepting Mariology.
Okay, well, so I I have talked to friends who have had this thought. I don't like it at all. First of all, you can do this with anything that doesn't fit your worldview. You can
Hmm
attribute it to demons. So I think it's a sort of lazy way out. Secondly, I know Coptic Christians. I like them. I have nothing against them or their beliefs. I just don't. They don't seem to me to be people who are following Satan or demons. Same thing with my Roman Catholic friends who have a Marian piety, right?
hmm
So uh, that, that doesn't work for me. And the other thing is that I think about Luke 11 and Matthew 12 and Mark 3. When Jesus casts out demons, his opponents say, "Oh, well, that must be demonic because he's not one of us. So since he's doing things we can't explain, we'll say it must be Beelzebul, right?" So I would be real hesitant to invoke the sort of rhetorical strategy that Jesus's opponents used on him when
Mm.
they didn't like something. So um, I guess I would say I'm allergic to that, and I don't like it at all.
Mm. So, I mentioned that this is all in the context of your book on the resurrection of Jesus, and you use it in
Mhm.
your book as well to basically give us some lessons about assessing what possibly happened that Easter morning
Mhm.
2000 years ago. And so I wanted to just let you now explain, what might Zeitoun teach us? What are some lessons that we can learn, yeah, when we look at the resurrection debate?
So one thing that I think is important is that many historians come to discussion of the resurrection with the conviction that unusual, metanormal, supernatural, inexplicable things don't happen. So whatever did happen, they must have the explanation in their toolkit. And so they'll pull out hallucination or they'll pull out fraud or whatever it is, and they'll say, okay, that explains it. I think Zeitoun is a really good example of a supernatural claim of religious experience, and I don't see that you can reduce it or explain it away in ordinary terms. Now, of course, somebody might 10 years from now down the road, I don't know. But as of the present, I have found no way to account for this in normal terms. And if you can find one event like that, I think you can find others,
Mm.
then this, I think, should be a caution for coming to the resurrection, knowing that certain things can't happen. Um, so this is a sort of metaphysical caution, you know. You just don't be sure of yourself that if you have some amazing story that you can explain it away. So that's one thing. Second thing I think is really important is that Protestants who do know this story don't typically come away saying it was Mary. They might say demons, or they might say, well, I don't know, but it just can't be Mary because that doesn't fit. And I think this shows the importance of worldview for understanding data. So some of my conservative apologist friends think they can sort of show that or prove that Jesus, to an unbiased observer, that Jesus rose from the dead. Well, I think historical facts are more malleable than that, and that your worldview is actually the thing that maps them. The isolated historical data points aren't what dictate your worldview. Your worldview doesn't just magically appear out of some facts, right? So uh, I think it's kind of funny because apologists will constantly say to those who don't believe in the resurrection, well, please just consider the facts, look at them, ponder them, contemplate them, and surely you'll see that. But they don't do that with
Mm.
Zeitoun. They're just okay. Well, they're just being human. That's it. They're just being human. And since it doesn't fit their worldview, they're going to avoid coming to a Roman Catholic conclusion because they don't want to be Roman Catholics, right?
Hmm.
That's it. That's
Hmm.
what it comes down to. So I think this does tell you about the importance of worldview in trying to uh, analyze historical historical claims. Also, I don't really like to think about this because it makes things more complicated, and Christians don't like to think about this either. But in the literature on Zeitoun, written by faithful Christians, you'll hear things like Mary appeared to 10,000, or Mary appeared to hundreds of thousands, or Mary appeared to millions. And when people are just summarizing Zeitoun, that's what they'll say. She appeared to crowds and so on and so on. But if you read the testimonies, among the agreement, there's also often disagreement. Or
Yeah.
sometimes one person will see Mary and the person next to that person won't see Mary, or will see you know, an undifferentiated column of light or something like this. And I think this it teaches you a lesson. So when Paul says Jesus appeared to the 500, you just have to be cautious. Well, did they all see the same thing? Exactly the same. We don't have 500 separate interviews, you know, with a notary public stamp saying, you know, here's my firsthand testimony. There's no way to know, even if it's a sort of consensus that the crowd saw Mary at Zeitoun, and even if there's a consensus that maybe the 500 saw Jesus, that doesn't tell you anything about the individual differences, different points of view, and so on. You just have to admit that once you look into a case like Zeitoun, it tells you how little maybe you know about some things that you thought you knew about the resurrection uh, appearance of Jesus. So
Mm.
uh, maybe well, so those are some of the things that I think are worth pondering when
Right.
you're thinking about the resurrection of Jesus. And that's why I wanted to have a chapter on this in my book. But I also wanted just to introduce people such as yourself to this really interesting whatever it is.
All right. And you've mentioned before that, if let's say that the evidence for the resurrection, is really compelling, right? Um, just as the evidence for Zeitun just seems to be really overwhelming. Just as a Protestant could look at that and say, well, I'm not really sure what happened there. I guess
Uh-huh.
strange stuff just happens, and just
Hmm.
leave it there. the skeptic could do the same thing with the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus.
And they do sometimes.
Yeah.
Uh, and they do. And if somebody wants to say, I've looked at the evidence, I don't want to be a Christian, it doesn't fit
Yeah.
my worldview, I get it. If they are firmly entrenched in their worldview, if they're convinced that they're right about it, there's, what are you going to do? Look, I'm a Christian. I have faith in God. But, if I were to read a really good book by a really smart atheist that had really good arguments against the existence of God, it'd be really tough for me to say, okay, I'm sorry. I've been wrong my whole life, right? I'm just chucking it in. I'm going to become an atheist. It'd be
Mm.
really hard, right? It's hard to change worldview, especially after your 20s. It's easier when you're a teenager,
Yeah.
but by the time you're through your 20s, it's really hard to become a totally different person. It sometimes happens, but it's a rarity. You're usually entrenched in your worldview at a fairly young age, at
Mm.
least roughly.
And you've said here and elsewhere that you're basically agnostic, right, on the exact explanation for what's going on at Zeitoun all those years ago. And I
Yeah.
wanted to, yeah, I wanted to ask you, I mean, even and you mentioned in part the fact that you're Protestant and Mariology doesn't factor much into your particular, maybe theological beliefs,
Uh-huh.
but could you see yourself maybe being a Protestant who does believe that Mary appears in the world at times?
Oh, sure. I can even I have this may sound weird to you. I have friends who aren't religious or aren't Christian who think that maybe Mary appears sometimes or that Jesus appears sometimes. They just don't have a traditional Christology or a
Hmm.
traditional Mariology, but they believe sometimes the dead people can communicate with the living. So why not Mary or why not Jesus, right? So yeah, one of the things you have to think about here is that Mary doesn't just appear to Christians in this story, she
Right.
appears to Muslims. Not only that, but one of the really interesting things, which I haven't been able to find that much about, is that there are countless healing stories associated with this event or this series of events. And this includes lots of Muslims who say they were healed. So, one of the first individuals, one of the mechanics to see this figure of light, had a finger that was gangrenous, or he had gangrene in his finger. And he was scheduled to have his finger cut off the next day after the first event happened. And the story is that when he went to the doctor, the gangrene is gone. Now, gangrene isn't something that just goes away on its own, right?
Hmm.
So he attributed this to Mary, and he said, this was the finger I pointed to her with, right? And my finger was healed. Okay. Now, just for the sake of discussion, let's say he was healed. What does that mean? Does that mean Mary is ecumenical and she doesn't really care about your theology? And it does raise interesting questions like this. So one of my problems, one of the things I've been working on for a long time is that miracles aren't confined to any one tradition. So they're not confined to the Catholic tradition. They're not confined to the Orthodox tradition. They're not confined to the Christian tradition. You have amazing stories and firsthand accounts of things all over the world. And so this raises questions as to, uh, what miracles mean. If there are different types of miracles, are there some that are evidential and others that aren't? Are there, going back
Hmm.
to your question, some people would say, are all miracles divine? Can't the Antichrist do miracles? What about the magicians in Pharaoh's court who could do half of what Moses? How are they getting that done, right?
Hmm.
So, or heck, Matthew 7, uh, when Jesus rejects people who said, we did many mighty works in your name. How did they do that? And he says, I don't care about you. So there
Hmm.
is this biblical idea that a miracle might be a sign, but it's not a proof by itself of anything. The Gospel of John, all the ambiguity of the signs and, how do you read them and so on. So I still think there's a lot of work to be done because, especially since the Enlightenment, people have just automatically thought, well, if there's a miracle, it confirms that tradition, and so we have to debunk it, which is what, well, starts with the Reformation, with the Protestants who have to debunk all Catholic miracles on the assumption that if any of them occur, they've got to become Roman Catholics. So, on my reading of history, the first modern skeptics are Protestants who just look at all the Catholic miracles and get rid of all of them. I mean, they're really skeptical. They don't believe anything, right? But it's because they think that if any of it happened, then Roman Catholicism must be true. I think that doesn't necessarily follow. So that's a whole another discussion. But I don't see why a Protestant couldn't say this is Mary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So when I was reading this book recently, this new book on Zeitoun, reading the firsthand testimonies, there's part of me, a voice in the back of my head saying, maybe this is Mary. Maybe this is Mary. Maybe it is. I'm not dogmatic about it. So maybe this will sound weird to your audience, but I'd be delighted to find out it's Mary.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Wouldn't bother me.
Yeah, and you mentioned before how some Catholics and some Orthodox might take this or other like really great, well-attested Marian apparitions as just slam dunks for their particular view against, let's say, Protestantism or other religions. But I wanted to ask you if there are any. I mean, you already mentioned so far how you can even interpret Zeitoun in multiple ways, not just in favor of, let's say, a Roman Catholic view of Mary, so on and so forth. Um, are there religions and other, let's say, or excuse me, are there miracles in other religions that are similarly well attested or that you think people should take seriously?
Yeah, so I think there are miracles in other traditions which are well attested, but not like this. So as far as I know, this is the best attested so-called miracle in history. I think it is. And the second best attested, I think, is the levitations of Joseph of Cupertino, who's a 17th century Roman Catholic, very strange person. But the amount of testimony for that is unbelievable, all right? And it goes over decades. And it comes from all sorts of people. It comes from Protestants who saw him levitate and then converted, right? It's exceedingly odd, but the testimony, and there it's testimony that was taken during the beatification process, testimonies from people who were alive and saw Joseph do this. And we have them, swearing by God, they saw this, that, and the other thing. So that is there. I am not an expert on Indian miracles, but I've talked to people and I've read some books, and I know that India is full of miracle stories. And I know that some of them are difficult to debunk. Also, I have some friends and family who have been involved in other religions and have told me stories. I have a son who had a meeting with a high Tibetan person, one of these Tibetan saints. He was 90 years old or whatever, and he was with 3 other people. They had an audience with a translator with this holy person. And my son and the people with him swear that he glowed, that he shed light. And they looked around. Is this coming in from the window? What the heck is going on? Look, he's my son. I've talked to him about it. He thinks it happened. So what does this mean? Is this an endorsement of Tibetan Buddhist philosophy? You got to be careful here. So I don't know what it means. All right. So you know that the Coptic Christians are traditionally heretics in light of, the Monophysite controversy and all that stuff. So is Mary now pronouncing in favor of, the one nature of Christ because she's on top of a Coptic church as opposed to somewhere else? What does it mean when she appears in a Catholic context? Does it mean she doesn't care which context it is? Is she doctrinally relativistic? So once you, I don't want to be a deconstructor here. I'm not, but you need to push past easy generalizations and conclusions. So if you say it was Mary, what does it mean that some of the people who saw her say she's just like the statue I grew up with?
Mm,
Or she's got the costume in my church, but those develop in the Middle Ages. So does Mary really wear, blue and white? Uh, you know, does she really have the stars on her chest? That's an artistic tradition.
mhm.
So how is that plain? Is that condescension, as the church fathers might say? So Jesus didn't eat, but he ate anyway to prove to the disciples. So Mary is going to appear in a form that they recognize, even though her real form is something unfathomable, right?
Mm.
I mean, it raises all these fascinating questions. Um, what kind of a body is this, right? What is this? It floats around and it disappears, but it's about the same height as a human body.
Right.
6, 5'10" or whatever it is, with not counting the halo. Uh, I think it raises fascinating questions, and wish I had more time to think
Mm.
about them.
All right, Professor, I have two more questions for you real
Okay.
quick. So my next to last question is we've already talked about before, Protestant resurrection apologists who really just want to prove that the resurrection of Jesus
Hmm.
happened. And whenever I've seen them, when they're asked about Marian apparitions or miracle claims in Roman Catholicism or
Uh-huh.
even other religious traditions, they kind of tend to like dismiss it and kind of shoo it away, or they say the resurrection is markedly different, so on and so forth. What would you want to say to these particular apologists?
Well, so I think that they are experiencing what we all experience, which is confirmation bias, right? So you're attracted to the things that fit and you don't like the things that don't fit. And they are uncomfortable, if I may be so bold to speak for some of them, they're uncomfortable looking in detail at something like Zeitoun because they're genuine Protestants and there's no room for Mary. And they've been taught from the beginning that Mariology is Mariolatry, and
Hmm.
it's just bad. But I think we don't have any photos of the risen Jesus from the first century. We don't have any detailed firsthand accounts of appearances. We just have Paul, Jesus said to me, and then the accounts in the Gospels. But we don't have testimony after testimony after testimony from people. We don't have testimony from people who didn't belong to the early Christian religion. We don't have testimony from people who didn't belong to any religion at all. We don't have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of witnesses. We don't have ongoing documentation as this is happening. So our sources come, the earliest sources are in the 50s, right? Paul's earliest letters. The resurrection appearances happened, I don't know, 30, 33, somewhere around in there. So we've got to wait 20 years before we get written testimony. We've got pictures and written testimony as this is going on. So uh, even though for a Christian, the resurrection, I think for any Christian, the resurrection has to be more important than whatever happened at Zeitoun. In
Hmm.
terms of evidence, I think Zeitoun uh, is just obviously way better, way better. Even if we'd like it to be the other way around, it's just not. We have to be honest.
I mean, that actually answers the next question I was going to ask you, which is a friend of mine wanted to know what you thought, which has better evidence, the resurrection
Yeah,
or okay.
I think that's an easy question. Again, there's a difference between how important a belief is and what the historical evidence for
Yeah.
it is. And we're often confusing those two things. So, it's a refrain with me, but I think uh, worldviews don't just come out. I don't think they're forced by a handful of historical facts or probabilities. I just don't think that's what's going on.
Mm.
I think that our worldviews, which are the products of many, many things, uh,
Yeah.
they are helping us to move the data around and construe it and stick things together in a certain way. It's just inevitable.
Mm.
Um, and they're also dictating conclusions. Again, I think I could put myself in the shoes of a Coptic Christian and just say, this is a slam dunk. What's wrong with you? It's just,
Yeah.
what's wrong with you? Right? Okay. Uh, but I don't think it's like that with the New Testament. I don't think you read the New Testament and just say, this is a slam dunk for everybody. I just
Hmm.
don't. I if it were, you wouldn't have all these big long books, engaging all the skeptical arguments. Um, I just don't think so.
Well, Professor Allison, it was a delight talking to you today, and especially just, um, I don't want to say brutal, but you're just straightforward honesty. I really appreciate it. Yeah.
I don't know what else is helpful, right?
hmm So, Professor, I know that you recently released your book, Interpreting Jesus, and so
Uh,
could you just briefly talk about that?
Well, it's a hard book to talk about because it's like all my other books on Jesus. The central theme, the central subject is topics that interest the author. So it's not a biography. It is a book about several things I'm really interested in. So one is miracles. So we've touched a little bit on that. So this is my attempt to tackle that issue as an historian. It's got a long chapter on Jesus and Moses, and
hmm
I think this is way more important than people have thought. Jesus's desire to imitate and assimilate himself to Moses. So there's a chapter on that. There's a chapter on eschatology where I'm trying to revise some of the things I've said before. There's a chapter on method where I'm debating what the best way is to go about trying to figure out um, what historians can say with confidence about Jesus. There's a chapter on eyewitnesses, and that whole bit, that debate, and then I have a long chapter on Jesus and women, and an attempt to understand some of the sayings in the Gospels in terms of the context given by Jesus roaming around from time to time with some women in his company.
hmm
So those are all, I think, really interesting, important topics. They're together in a book, but they don't make for, like one thesis. The whole book is just things that I think are interesting and important and that I've been working on, and I think I have my penny to contribute.
Well, Professor Allison, it's in my eyes, it's a giant penny, and so we're all enriched by it. All right, and with that, just thank you once again.
Thank you. Lovely to meet you.